So, Jessica Wilson, how did you get started in academia? What's your history and career?
Well, let's see. When I graduated from high school, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and actually I went to art school to start for a year and a half. That's something I'd always enjoyed doing. But I felt as if I didn't really have the, what I would call the vision, so to speak, to make art a career. You know, I was technically okay at it, but so dropped out of that, worked as a picture framer for a couple of years, met some people, including my boyfriend at the time, who were studying physics, and thought that sounded really cool. I was very interested in natural reality. And so I went to the University of Maryland to study physics. When I got there, I found out that you needed to have a good deal of math in order to do physics. So after my first year, I did all right, but I realized I needed to get more up to speed in math. I took a bunch of math courses, and in the process, I found out that I was actually much better at math than I was at physics, for whatever reason. So I ended up getting a math degree. Along the way, I had picked up computer programming. I was working as a computer programmer, so I worked for a couple of years after that as a computer programmer. That was lucrative, but I found it not to be that interesting. So, again, going back to my original interest in natural reality, so to speak, I thought, I've got to go back to school. I want to maybe study, something that would help me further that interest. Do something that involved reading and thinking, writing, and so on and so forth. So actually at the time I was living in Boulder, Colorado, and was flipping through the course catalog, and I came across the philosophy listings. And interestingly, I hadn't ever taken any philosophy courses in my previous education. So I'd had courses that were, I don't know, maybe like political science course or something where they would touch on work that had been done by philosophers, but they tended to be kind of more, it was like historically presented. So I had an incorrect impression of philosophy as a kind of, intellectual history of ideas or something. I didn't realize at the time that it was a thriving discipline, and actually very broad-ranging discipline. So when I came across the course listings for philosophy at the University of Colorado Boulder in their catalog, I was just really struck by some of the things that were being offered, because they were exactly the sort of thing I was interested in, and I just didn't know that philosophy was the place to study them. So in particular, metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of science, and all those were very much, I found out, I thought I might be interested in those courses, and when I took them, I found out, this is exactly what I was looking for. So at that point, I thought, okay, great, I'm going to get up to speed in philosophy and go to graduate school in philosophy and just keep studying this. Wasn't really sure where it would all end up. But one thing led to another, and I ended up at Cornell, getting a PhD in philosophy, and Sidney Shoemaker was my chair, and I also had Jason Stanley and Richard Boyd as members of my committee, and I ended up writing a dissertation that was, again, reflecting my interest in natural reality and how complex entities depend on what seem to be lower level entities, and these sort of comprehensive theses about natural reality associated with, for example, physicalism, according to which all the broadly scientific entities are nothing over and above, in one way or another, the fundamental physical entities, or emergence of one sort of another, asking whether or not there can be genuine emergence that is compatible with physicalism and genuine emergence that might not be compatible with physicalism, these two different sort of non-reductive views. So my dissertation was looking at how it would be best to formulate those different positions, right? I wasn't arguing for any of them. but rather just considering how it would be best to to characterize these views in a way that they were, they appropriately contrasted and were presumably or hopefully naturalistically acceptable, and so on and so forth. So my the dissertation title was Physicalism, Emergentism, and Fundamental Forces. So I'm actually still working on those issues among a lot of other things. And in fact, I'm currently working on a book called Metaphysical Emergence, which reaches back to my dissertation and a lot of work that I've done in the meantime, developing these positions and views and trying to articulate exactly how special science entities depend on more fundamental physical entities and the like. So then after I graduated from Cornell, I got a job at the University of Michigan, tenure track position there. And I was a William Wilhart's assistant professor, so they gave me a nice honorary position, and I was there for 4 years. In the meantime, Benj and I had gotten married. Benj was had recently, about the same year as I did, gotten his degree from Princeton and then gotten a job at Cornell. So we met at Cornell. We were commuting back and forth. He was at Cornell, I was at Michigan, and then we were looking for jobs together. And the University of Toronto made us an offer, and then we came here together, and we've been here ever since.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So it certainly seems your interests revealed themselves to you over time.
Yeah.
What kind of things really do you think drove you into this subject? Is it your inherent interest in it, or what are the kind of uses and applications that we find in the subject you study?
Well, those are interesting questions. I mean, the things that drove me to investigate sort of in the way that I do, I think of myself as primarily doing metaphysics of science. And the things that led me to be interested in considering how complex entities depend on less complex entities, what the relations are, and so on and so forth. In a way, I think they stem back to my initial interest in art, because there I was kind of interested in structure and form, and wondering what made things have the form in natural reality, in particular, why things have the form they do. Like, why is a honeycomb shaped like, or the cells shaped like hexagons, and why do soap bubbles form in the way they do, and so on. So I was kind of interested in these issues about how things are shaped, how they present themselves as being a certain way, why, what are the underlying mechanisms for why things are that way. So I think that interest has always just kind of run through. I've just been I'm curious about how things work in a way, why things look the way they do, why they act the way they do. So that explains in a way the first question, or it's a candidate answer to the first question of what led me to these kind of interests. As far as the applications and so on, I think it's an interesting question that philosophers often face. Like what are the applications of your intellectual theorizing? Direct applications of the sort that you might be able to apply in a lab. There are philosophers who work on those sorts of things, and I think the results that I hope to have established, could enter indirectly into scientific investigations. But I think if they do, I think it would be more along the theoretical than the experimental dimensions. And providing, I see myself and a lot of philosophers who work in related areas as trying to get clear about the conceptual and methodological resources for investigating whatever the phenomenon is that at issue. So we provide, and philosophers have always provided for scientists tools that enable them to think about what they're doing in an appropriately ecumenical way, right? So scientists don't necessarily think about the space of possibility, or how, when presented with some data, what are the options for interpreting that data. Those are the sorts of things that philosophers can try to articulate. And so just to give you one example, this is not necessarily drawn specifically from my work, but David Lewis and his thesis, according to which the truth of claims about what's possible or necessary are somehow grounded in a space of concrete possible worlds that are equally as real as this one, was it's a philosophical theory about the nature of possibility and what makes modal claims true, but it has been really, I think, picked up in the scientific community as providing a comprehensive illustration of the coherence of thinking about quantum mechanics in certain ways, as involving, say, a multiverse or multiple worlds and so on.
Mm-hmm.
There are connections, between these disciplines that I think show up typically in theoretical investigations.
So as far as specifically the sort of ideas and challenges you face, if you had to explain to a layperson what ideas and concepts you deal with, like what are the same things? Like what is emergence?
Mm-hmm.
What are the implications?
How to explain that to a layperson?
Mm-hmm.
I often will start with the mind-body problem because many people have heard of that and have some idea of what that involves. So I see myself in a way as working on a generalization of the mind-body problem where, just as in that case, you have some feature of reality which clearly appears to depend on some other. So the mind clearly seems to depend somehow on the body. If I injure my brain, my mental states are going to be impacted, and so on. But on the other hand, our mentality seems to have a certain kind of autonomy vis-a-vis the physical or the body. It seems like my mental states, my mind. It's hard to see that it's just kind of a collection of subatomic goings on, no matter how complex. It seems to have distinctive features, and it also seems to my mental states seem to enter into distinctive causal interactions. So if I reach for my glasses in order to, provide you an illustration of my agency, that seems to be the causal interaction that's occurring at the level of mentality, so to speak. Which is not to say that there couldn't be these intimate relationships between mental causation, mental causal interactions, and physical causal interactions. But anyway, that's just a setup that in a way motivates or gives rise to the mind-body problem, right? Because the question is, how exactly do we understand the combination of features here where you have mind being dependent on body, but yet mind also seeming to be, in certain respects, independent of body, autonomous maybe ontologically or causally. So in looking at the special sciences and complex entities and asking, what are our options for understanding how they're related to more fundamental goings on or less complex configurations of more fundamental goings on, really I'm looking at, again, a generalization of the mind-body problem. And so that's how I often will start or kind of explain to people, one big area of my research interests.
Cool.
Yeah.
So, awesome journey through academia.
Yeah.
What kind of... But to be like the person you are, interested in mathematics, did you have to face any intellectual or societal barriers to get where you are today? Like what kind of obstacles did you have to overcome?
Well, it was very hard really to start a new field, so to speak, or try to get up to speed in philosophy after I hadn't studied it as an undergraduate. So I felt for many years that I was kind of playing catch up. But that said, I think having studied physics and math, and also art, really, that turned out to be pretty good training for doing philosophy. Hey, Bench, honey, can you hold Pirate?
Right here.
Turned out to be pretty good training for philosophy because it's useful to be able to think in pretty systematic ways, right? And doing math, logic, science kind of trains you up in those respects. So, notwithstanding that I didn't have an education in philosophy, I picked it up pretty quickly. But as far as other barriers, one of the things as a metaphysician or a philosopher of science is that you have to be pretty familiar with the sciences in order to appropriately engage with them philosophically. So one of the things I felt that I needed to do in order to continue my own research was to get more up to speed in physics and fundamental physics. And so I applied for a National Science Foundation grant, and I got it. That gave me a year off, basically, to study physics. So my third year out of graduate school, I had a year off where I basically worked with a senior graduate student in physics at Cornell who was effectively my personal tutor. So we went through classical mechanics, electromagnetism, quantum mechanics, and relativity field theory. So, certainly I wouldn't say that I have, even master's level expertise, but I can read the equations. I know what they mean. I know why they're motivated and so on. I have, in a way, I was able to get enough education, for my purposes. In a way, part of what I was learning as well as what I didn't need to know, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't need to be able to calculate the position of a complex planetary system or something like that, right? I just need to be able to understand or get insight into how scientists are thinking about dependency and so on.
Mm-hmm. So it seems, of course, very important for you as a philosopher to know the positions of science. How would you approach a scientist and say it's important as a scientist to know the positions of philosophy as science being a subject derived from natural philosophy or equivalent to?
Yeah, that's a great question. Scientists are often kind of strangely empiricist or hesitant to enter into philosophical arenas, which is in a way surprising because, as you say, philosophy and science both are, like, in a way, they were both born out of natural philosophy, where you couldn't really even distinguish the two. I think the best scientists are philosophically sensitive, and, well, when I say the best, I mean some of the best anyway, and especially theoretical physicists tend to be pretty philosophically sophisticated. They have to be, because part of what they're trying to do is, engage in what is, broadly speaking, philosophical interpretation of, and systematic theorizing about, broad swaths of phenomena. So, what a lot of them are doing philosophy, whether they know it or not. And some of them do it better than others. But to the extent that they're familiar with the metaphysical options, they'll be better positioned to creatively explore, ways of thinking about the data. So I think, notwithstanding that a lot of physicists are and scientists in general are kind of knee-jerk empiricists for whatever reason, that isn't true across the board, number one. And number two, I think scientists who say that are in a way, they're just uninformed about what philosophers are really on about. There's a kind of character, maybe it's just, unfamiliarity with what philosophers are actually doing. There's this kind of caricature that's associated with Descartes sitting in his armchair in the study, according to which philosophers think that they can do everything a priori without any sensitivity to natural reality. But that's just simply false as regards most philosophers these days, and especially philosophers who are working on science or metaphysics of science. It's just an inaccurate take on what they're doing. So hopefully there will be increasing crosstalk across the disciplines. And I've gone to several conferences where there were both scientists and philosophers, and they've been really fruitful.
Good. It's great to hear.
Yeah.
So I think a bit earlier too, you were mentioning what kind of perspectives you get to take on as a philosopher. If you were to describe just the average virtues or benefits that are associated with being a philosopher, the kind of perspectives and views you get from this background, what would they be?
On a personal level? Or,
Sure.
One thing I have experienced in studying philosophy, I've noticed a trajectory. It's not clear to me if this is due to philosophy or just getting older and wiser, but I think one thing about philosophical argumentation and dialectic is that it assists you in gaining some distance from a position, which even if you maybe personally hold it yourself, feel very strongly about it, whatever else, it enables you to sort of philosophical sort of practice enables you to see your position and other people's positions with I don't want to say objectivity, but just not be so tied up or embedded in your own position that you can't see outside of it. And I remember when I first started doing philosophy, I used to sometimes get very agitated about, in the course of philosophical discussions, about, feeling almost personally attacked if someone disagreed with me or with my argumentation and stuff like that. And nowadays, it's really quite the opposite. So I'm always very grateful now if somebody will take the time to actually try to criticize what I'm saying or whatever else. Because I just have a different perspective on, what it is to try to arrive at a plausible or correct position about something. I see myself almost in a way as a scientist who is testing we're testing various hypotheses, and we don't test them always in the same way that an ordinary scientist will do. We test them by looking at these theoretical desiderata, typically, such as, coherence. Does it make sense of the data to the extent that we understand it? How does the hypothesis fit with other stuff that we believe? Is it systematic? Does it cover a wide range of phenomena? Is it fruitful? Does it give rise to new ways of thinking about things? So all those sorts of considerations are on the table, and I just see discussion and debate as, really a form of many heads are better than one, because no one of us is really in a position to sort of creatively think about all the possibilities, all the counterexamples that might be relevant to a given thesis, right? So I think one thing that it says to help me become a more, not a less passionate person, but a more, a dispassionate person with respect to some of these issues, I think relatedly too is related to my own view about the methodology of philosophy and kind of where we're at as far as philosophical progress is concerned. I feel that we're really at a very rudimentary stage of philosophical investigation. And that may or may not be true of scientific investigation to the extent that it's informed by philosophical concepts and so on. At least at the fundamental theoretical level, we're still working with theories that are mutually inconsistent and so on. So it's kind of, there's still probably a lot of interesting action that's going to happen scientifically as well. But one thing that's a little bit distinctive about philosophy is that, as I was pointing out earlier, we have all these theoretical or broadly theoretical desiderata, coherence, fruitfulness, systematicity, plausibility, conformity to other stuff we believe, and so on. But exactly how to weight all those desideratas is not something that there's a lot of mutual agreement about within the philosophical community. So, you might have people for whom parsimony, right, is really kind of an overriding guide, right, to their theorizing. So they want to just be able to do the most with as few posits as possible, and even if that requires that, there has to be a lot of twisting and turning and kludgy, seemingly unsystematic reconstructions of things that we would sort of naturally believe, right? So that if you want to say, the only entities that really exist are the fundamental physical entities standing in fundamental physical relations, and really nothing else really exists. So it's not a table per se, right? That's distinct. There could be some kind of aggregate of, let's say, atoms or whatever, and then you say, yeah, but look, if I chip off the corner, the aggregate is different, but the table still exists, and so what you're going to have is an identification maybe of the table with the disjunction of all the possible atomic aggregates and so on and so forth. So, that's in some sense, you've decreased the number of entities in your ontology. You don't have any tables, you just have aggregates of atoms. But your account of the table is much more complex ideologically, you might say, than just that of somebody who says, no, of course there's a table and it's different from, it depends on some collections of atoms, but it's not identical to any even complex combination of those aggregates. So how to legislate between different weightings of the desiderata, the theoretical principles or guiding principles, that's a big open question in philosophy right now, where I feel like we're just now making some really interesting progress in trying to figure out, is there, can we arrive at some kind of consensus about this, right? Or is it just going to be that there'll be a face-off between the people who think that, naturalness and systematicity are the overriding desiderata, and the people who think that parsimony and associated forms of reductionism are overriding. Mm-hmm. I don't know, But anyway, what I do know is that given that philosophy has such a broad purview, right, literally takes in every area of potential data into its, as data into its as input into theorizing, right? Whether it's from language, ordinary experience, the sciences, other philosophical theories, etc. We, in a way, are the most general science, the most general investigation into whatever, because everything is fair game as input into our theorizing. But then that makes this a very, very complicated equation to try to solve. Number one, so there's much more data than there is in most other areas of investigation. But then number two is the point I was just talking about. There's no current consensus about exactly how to assess philosophical accounts or theories. So I guess summing up, I think we're really far from the end of philosophical inquiry right now. And as such, just to go back to this question of, how philosophy, I think, has influenced me, having recognized that, I also am much less inclined to think that I've got the right story in any given case, right? I mean, everything is kind of provisional right now. Say, well, given these methodological considerations, given this data, I think I can make a pretty good case that this is the correct account of blah, 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 right? But I'm not going to fight to the death over that, because in a way we're not near the finish line. We have to watch out about being dogmatic at this point, right? Because we're not in a position to be justifiably dogmatic. Being dogmatic is not necessarily bad if you're like absolutely certain. I'd be dogmatic about the fact that 2 + 2 = 4. Come what may, I'm going to hold on to that. That's fine. But for these more, really complex and very subtle inferences to the best explanation that are typical of philosophical theories about any given area of experience or phenomena or whatever, we don't. I think it would be unwise. It's premature. Put it that way. It's premature to be dogmatic. Mm-hmm. So it makes. I guess what I'm trying to say is that philosophy makes you more open-minded.
Cool.
And it's not a relativist view, but you're just like, okay, I see why you can understand why somebody else would hold a position. That doesn't mean that you think their position is equally correct or whatever. You're not saying that truth is relative or anything else. You're just saying we're not in position yet to decisively claim of any given position that it is the one true position.
Cool. And to get on this path of philosophy, do you think anyone can do it? Do you think there's a value in everyone picking up some philosophical methodology? Like, how would someone get started as a philosopher, and why would they do it?
Yeah. Good. Well, I think in general that we're all, I've said this, I think we've had a conversation along these lines. I think we're all born philosophers along a kind of general dimension where, here we are, we're in the world, we're trying to interpret perceptually and otherwise, data that's coming to us. People are telling us things as we learn to speak. We become familiar with different positions and so on. We're constantly assessing, as a result of all this information, what we should believe and what we should do and how we should act in order to accomplish what we want to do and so on. So anyone who does that, and that's pretty much everyone to some extent, I think they are constructing theories that are broadly philosophical in the course of just figuring out what they believe, right? Mm-hmm. Philosophy can be thought of as just a very self-conscious way of figuring out what to believe. I think a lot of people are just doing this kind of in the matter of course. As philosophers, we're saying, okay, well, here's some interesting phenomenon. What exactly should I believe about this at this point? What is it reasonable to believe about this? And what are the considerations that should enter into it? So I think that most people can and in fact are already doing some form of philosophy. And then what we can do as philosophers who are, or what people can do when they study philosophy explicitly is they are making explicit to themselves and refining their usual ways of kind of processing and accommodating, incorporating information into a belief system. Some people, I think, are, they enjoy that more than others, but certainly I think it would be useful in general to be self-conscious about your forms of reasoning, the modes of reasoning. That would also be useful to almost anyone to become more aware of, this process, in part because following up on what I was saying earlier, I think it makes you less dogmatic. It can also prevent you from falling into certain kinds of natural traps, right? Where you think you just mistakenly don't see some other options, you know. So methodologically, it can help people to say, okay, well, let me think here. So and so said this, but are there other ways of thinking about this, right? Sort of trains you up to creatively pursue alternative ways of thinking about something and not just take things for granted. And relatedly, it, I think, helps you not just improve your own modes of thinking, right? But also put you in position to kind of, well, to assess other people's forms of reasoning and stand on your own argumentative 2 feet, right? So if somebody says, well, somebody makes some claim and then provides a certain kind of argument for it, you'll be in position to assess that argument. You can say, look, that argument, so as you've expressed it, doesn't yet go through because look, you know, those premises could be satisfied, but the conclusion wouldn't follow. It sort of trains you up and gives you the power to, trains you up and gives you the power to assess claims and associated argumentation, which I think is probably, there's nothing that is really more important when it comes to being a member of society. So, for example, I just wrote our counselor a letter, an email, where I said, look, I'm just not buying your argument here, right? And here's why. And I was able to articulate why I felt that the rationale he had been providing didn't hold up to scrutiny. And this enables you to be in a position to I don't know, to do a lot of things, but perhaps most importantly is not to have to take for just at face value what other people tell you. You know, you don't have to. You're given tools that enable you to critically assess what other people would have you believe, right? And you know, for better or worse, you know, a lot of times people will want you to believe something, and maybe that's good for you, maybe it's not. But in any case, you know, you want to be able to assess whether you really should follow them in that, especially in politics or, you know. Mm-hmm. The social arena, right? In part, though, this makes philosophers kind of potentially irritating to hang around with. A lot of philosophers end up getting married to other philosophers or hanging around with other philosophers because, you know, sometimes you just can't help yourself from correcting, quote unquote, somebody else's form of reasoning. But I think at the end of the day, it's a good thing. And I wish more people did it.
Yeah, it seems like it's even related to a sense of autonomy in the world. Like, as far as it may take away from relatedness, unless you're hanging around with the philosophers, but to really rule your own viewpoint, to skeptically go through the various options of what the world is. And I certainly see how everyone at least has the potential to be a philosopher in some case, because they're given data, they're given propositions, and a lot of people accept those as just face value, but there's a lot there that the philosopher can help identify, of course. So if you had to give sort of a 30-second speech to the world, what would it be? What's your message?
30-second message to the world. Well, just appreciate being alive, appreciate reality. follow. I think my message would be to follow what really interests you, because I think a lot of people are studying, especially in an academic environment. They might be led to do something that they feel might, I don't know, be lucrative or whatever else. But you will be best at what you're interested in, and you will flourish and profit off of that. So I suggest, that people really try to figure out what you're interested in and then just jump in. That's the secret of a happy life. That's me.
Cool. The examined and interested life.
There you go.